Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. Edward here, so glad you've joined me again. Tell me, what's your favourite warm drink to enjoy while listening to these mysteries? Tea, cocoa, or perhaps a cosy cup of coffee? I love hearing about the small comforts that make your evening special, and of course, do subscribe if you haven't already. Now, get comfortable. The mystery awaits. Chapter 1. The Fog of Progress. The mist came rolling in from the sea like a living thing, thick and cold and determined to wrap itself around every croft, every fence post, every blade of grass in the village of Lochdoub. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood in his small garden, watching his sheep huddled together against the stone wall, their fleeces beaded with moisture. He pulled his jacket tighter and thought, not for the first time, that there was nothing quite so penetrating as a Highland mist in November. Hamish was a tall, thin man with hazel eyes and red hair that refused to lie flat no matter what he did to it. At this particular moment he was perfectly content. His sheep were fed, his dog Lugs was sprawled before the fire inside, and his wild cat Sonsi was probably curled up on his bed, shedding ginger fur all over the duvet. He had successfully avoided Superintendent Peter Davier's office for 3 weeks running, and Detective Chief Inspector Blair had been blessedly occupied with a spate of burglaries in Strathbane. Life, in short, was good. The peace lasted exactly as long as it took for a sleek black Range Rover to come roaring up the waterfront road, spraying gravel and scattering Mrs. Wellington's chickens in all directions. And yes, Hamish sighed. Nothing good ever arrived in Lochdoub in a vehicle that expensive. A man stepped out of the car and Hamish disliked him immediately. He was the sort of Londoner who wore his wealth like a weapon, all Barber jacket and green wellies that had never seen actual mud. His face was red and puffy, suggesting either high blood pressure or a fondness for expensive wine, and his voice when he spoke could have stripped paint. "You there, constable, I need to report a crime." Hamish ambled over slowly, enjoying the man's increasing irritation at his leisurely pace. "And what crime would that be, sir? Trespassing, theft, destruction of property." The man's jowls quivered with indignation. "I'm Alistair Pringle, consultant to Lord Strathcorey, and I've been hired to modernise the peat operations on his land. These villagers seem to think they can simply help themselves to his peat, as if we were living in the Middle Ages." "Well now," said Hamish mildly, "the folk hereabouts have been cutting peat from those bogs for generations. It's traditional like." "Traditional?" Pringle's voice rose to a bellow. "Traditional is not a legal concept, Constable. Lord Strathcorey owns that land, and I intend to see it properly exploited. There's a fortune to be made in peat power operations, and these locals are standing in the way of progress." Hamish felt a familiar sinking sensation in his stomach. Progress, in his experience, usually meant trouble for Lochdoub. "Perhaps you'd like to discuss this with the villagers, Mr. Pringle, in a friendly manner like." "I intend to do exactly that, tonight. At the pub." As Pringle roared off in his Range Rover, Hamish walked slowly back to his cottage. Lugs, a dog of indeterminate breed with huge ears that had earned him his name, looked up hopefully. "Trouble, boy," said Hamish. "I can smell it coming." By 7 o'clock that evening the Lochdoub pub was packed. Hamish stood at the bar nursing a small whisky and watching the crowd. There was Archie McLean, the fisherman, his face already flushed from his 4th pint and the blessed escape from his formidable wife. The Curry twins, Nessie and Jessie, sat in the corner, their grey heads together as they whispered and gossiped. Dr. Brodie stood near the fire, and even the Reverend Wellington had put in an appearance, his gentle face creased with concern. When Pringle arrived, silence fell like a curtain. "Right then," Pringle announced, pulling out a sheaf of papers, "I've prepared eviction notices for anyone caught trespassing on Lord Strathcorey's peat bogs after tomorrow. Furthermore, I'm implementing a licensing system for any traditional peat cutting, with fees to be determined." "Fees?" Archie McLean stood up, swaying slightly. "My family's been cutting peat from those bogs for 200 years. "Then your family has been trespassing for 200 years, Pringle said coldly. "The law is quite clear." The room erupted. Voices rose, fists were shaken, and Hamish resigned himself to a long night of peacekeeping. It was then that he noticed Mrs. Mary Sutherland slip quietly through the crowd. Mary was a widow, a soft-spoken woman who ran the village primary school and managed the local history society. She had a sweet face and gentle manner that made even the rowdiest children settle down in her classroom. Now she moved between the angry villagers like oil on troubled waters, her voice low and soothing. "Now, Mr. Pringle," she said, her tone respectful and calm. "Surely we can discuss this in a more civilized manner, perhaps over a cup of tea." Pringle turned to her, and his expression softened slightly. "At least someone in this godforsaken village has some sense." "Why don't I make us all some tea?" Mary suggested, "and I'm sure we can find some common ground." For the next hour, Mary worked her quiet magic. She served tea, she listened sympathetically to Pringle's plans, she gently deflected the worst of the villagers' anger. By the time Hamish left the pub, his head aching from the noise and drama, he found a basket waiting on his doorstep. Inside were fresh scones, still warm, and a note in Mary's neat handwriting. "Dear Hamish, thought you might need these after such a difficult evening. Stay warm, Mary." Hamish carried the basket inside, fed a scone to Lugs and broke off a piece for Sonsie. The wild cat purred, a sound like distant thunder. "Nice woman, that Mrs. Sutherland," Hamish said to his animals. "Kind, helpful." Lugs wagged his tail in agreement. Outside, the mist pressed against the windows, and somewhere out on the dark moor the peat bogs waited, ancient and patient, keeping their secrets close. Chapter 2. A Grim Discovery in the Mist. Hamish was dreaming of sunshine and empty beaches when the telephone shattered the pre-dawn darkness. He groped for the receiver, knocking over a glass of water in the process, while Lugs barked indignantly from the foot of the bed. "Macbeth," he mumbled. "Hamish, you'd better get yourself out to the peat bogs. There's something terrible wrong." It was Dougie Fraser, one of the local crofters, and his voice was shaking. Hamish was suddenly wide awake. "What's happened?" "It's that Pringle fellow. He's dead, Hamish, lying in the peat cutting like a broken doll." 20 minutes later, Hamish stood at the edge of the bog, his torch beam cutting through the grey murk of early morning. The mist was even thicker than yesterday, rolling across the dark earth in ghostly waves. Dougie waited by his battered Land Rover, his face pale. "I was checking on my ewes," Dougie explained, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Thought I'd lost one in the fog. That's when I saw him." Hamish approached the body carefully, his long legs finding purchase on the treacherous ground with the ease of someone who'd walked these moors all his life. Alistair Pringle lay sprawled in a shallow peat cutting, his expensive jacket soaked black with bog water. His head was crushed, and beside him lay the murder weapon, an antique cast-iron tushkar, its blade still wickedly sharp despite its age. Hamish recognised it immediately. The old peat cutter had been part of a heritage display in the village library, a relic from the days when every family depended on peat for warmth and survival. Someone had taken it, carried it across the moor in pitch darkness, and used it to end Pringle's life with a single devastating blow. He pulled out his mobile and made the necessary calls, first to Dr. Brodie, then to the police station in Strathbane. As he waited, he studied the scene with a practised eye. The killer had chosen this spot carefully. The cutting was invisible from the road, hidden in a fold of land that only locals would know. More importantly, reaching it required navigating a maze of hidden pools and soft ground that could swallow a man whole if he took a wrong step. Only someone who knew these bogs intimately could have made this journey in darkness without a light. A stranger would have needed a torch, and Hamish could see no evidence of one. No dropped batteries, no scuff marks from stumbling, no signs of hesitation. The killer had walked here as confidently as Hamish himself. Dr. Brodie arrived first, puffing and wheezing as he picked his way across the bog. He examined the body briefly, his expression grim. "Dead several hours, I'd say. Sometime after midnight. Single blow to the skull, death would have been instantaneous." He glanced at Hamish. "Poor devil never knew what hit him." "Aye," said Hamish softly, "but someone knew exactly what they were doing." The peace of the morning was shattered by the roar of engines. 3 police cars came bouncing across the moorland track, and Hamish's heart sank as he recognised the lead vehicle. Detective Chief Inspector Blair had arrived. Blair heaved himself out of the car, his red face already sweating despite the cold. He was a fat, belligerent man who ran on whiskey and spite, and his hatred of Hamish Macbeth was legendary throughout the force. "Right then, Macbeth," Blair bellowed. "Let's see what mess you've made of my crime scene." "I've touched nothing, sir," Hamish said mildly. "The body's exactly as Dougie found it." Blair ignored him, stomping across the bog with his team of detectives from Strathbane. They set up their equipment, took their photographs, and generally treated the locals with a kind of contempt that made Hamish's blood boil quietly beneath his calm exterior. "This'll be one of your village idiots," Blair announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mark my words, we'll have this wrapped up by tea time. Some local with a grudge, too stupid to cover his tracks properly." Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson caught Hamish's eye and gave a slight shrug. Jimmy was Blair's second in command, a decent man trapped in an indecent job. They'd worked together before, and Hamish knew he could be trusted, particularly after a generous measure of whiskey. It was while Blair was holding forth on the incompetence of village constables that Mrs. Mary Sutherland appeared through the mist, carrying a large thermos and a basket. "I heard what happened," she said quietly, her face drawn with shock. "I thought the poor men from Strathbane might need some hot coffee." Blair's expression softened slightly. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Sutherland. Mary Sutherland. I teach at the village school." She poured coffee into paper cups with steady hands, though Hamish noticed she was careful not to look at the body. Such a terrible thing. Who could have done such a thing? "That's what we're here to find out," Blair said importantly, accepting a cup. "Did you know the deceased?" "Only from the meeting at the pub last night. He seemed a very determined man." Mary's voice was gentle, non-judgmental. "I'm afraid he upset quite a few people with his plans for the peat bogs." "Is that so?" Blair's eyes gleamed. This was exactly what he wanted to hear. "Oh, yes." Mary pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "I took the liberty of writing down the names of everyone who argued with Mr. Pringle yesterday evening. I thought it might be helpful." She handed the list to Blair, who scanned it eagerly. Hamish watched, his instincts prickling. There was something almost too helpful about Mary's assistance, something too perfectly timed. "Archie McLean," Blair read aloud, "had a violent argument about a harbour shed. Dr. Brodie, whose past medical mistakes Pringle was threatening to expose, and several crofters who received trespassing notices." He looked at Mary with something approaching gratitude. "This is excellent work, Mrs. Sutherland. You've saved us considerable time." "I just want to help," Mary said softly. "We're a peaceful village. This is unprecedented." As the forensics team began their detailed examination of the scene, Hamish stood apart thinking. The list Mary had provided was accurate, certainly, but it was also convenient. Too convenient. It pointed Blair exactly where he wanted to go, toward the villagers Blair already despised. Jimmy Anderson sidled up to him, coffee cup in hand. "What are you thinking?" "Hamish?" "I'm thinking," Hamish said slowly, "that whoever killed Pringle knew these moors like the back of their hand. And I'm thinking that antique peat cutter didn't walk itself out of the library display." "Blair's already decided it's a local." Jimmy took a sip of coffee. "He'll probably arrest half the village by lunchtime." "Aye," said Hamish. "That's what worries me." By noon, the body had been removed, and the forensics team had found their first solid lead. Large, muddy boot prints led away from the scene, heading back toward the village. Within an hour, they'd matched them to a pair of Wellington boots belonging to Archie McLean. Blair was triumphant. "Told you it would be simple. Get McLean in for questioning." Hamish watched as the Strathbane detectives drove off toward Archie's cottage. Mary Sutherland stood nearby, her face troubled. "Poor Mr. McLean," she said quietly. "But I suppose the evidence doesn't lie." "No," said Hamish thoughtfully, "but sometimes it doesn't tell the whole truth either." As he walked back to his Land Rover, he noticed something caught on a clump of heather near the cutting. a tiny scrap of fabric so small he almost missed it. He picked it up carefully. It was good quality wool, dyed a soft dove grey, the kind a respectable woman might wear. Hamish tucked it into his pocket and said nothing. The game, as they say, was afoot. Chapter 3: Sifting the Highland Gossip. The Lochdoub police station was a small whitewashed building that had seen better days. Hamish sat at his desk, pretending to fill out paperwork while actually feeding scraps of bacon to lugs under the table. Sonsie sprawled across the filing cabinet, her amber eyes watching the morning light filter through the grimy windows. Hamish knew that Blair would charge in like a bull in a china shop, arresting anyone who looked at him sideways. The only way to protect the innocent villagers was to conduct his own investigation, quietly and without fuss. The problem was gathering information without alerting Blair to what he was doing. Fortunately, Hamish had resources that Blair could never access. He had lived in Lochdoub long enough to become part of its intricate social fabric, and the villagers trusted him in a way they would never trust the bombastic detective from Strathbane. His first stop was the Curry sisters. Nessie and Jessie Curry were twin spinsters who lived in a neat cottage overlooking the harbour. They were the village's primary source of gossip, though they preferred to call it keeping informed about community affairs. Hamish found them in their parlour, surrounded by enough floral upholstery to stock a garden centre. Terrible business, said Nessie, pouring tea into delicate china cups. Terrible business, echoed Jessie as she always did. Aye, it is that, Hamish agreed, accepting a cup and a slice of Dundee cake. I don't suppose you noticed anything unusual yesterday. The sisters exchanged glances, a form of communication that required no words. Well now, said Nessie, leaning forward conspiratorially, we did see Mr. Pringle down by the harbour in the afternoon. In the afternoon, Jessie confirmed. He was having words with a young man. A stranger he was. City clothes. Nervous manner. Nervous manner? Hamish felt a flicker of interest. What did this young man look like? 30-ish, maybe. Dark hair, expensive suit but rumpled like he'd been wearing it too long. They were arguing fierce. Fierce, said Jessie with relish. Could you hear what they were saying? Nessie shook her head regretfully. We were too far away. But the young man seemed desperate, you know. Kept grabbing at Mr. Pringle's arm, and Mr. Pringle kept shaking him off. Shaking him off. Hamish made a mental note. Shh. A mysterious stranger arguing with the victim hours before his death was certainly worth investigating. Did you see where this young man went? He headed toward the hotel, walking fast with his head down. Head down. After extracting himself from the Curry household, complete with a packet of shortbread pressed into his hands, Hamish made his way to see Angus MacDonald. Angus lived in a cottage so remote that even the postman complained. The old man had a reputation as a seer, claiming to have visions and predict the future. Hamish knew perfectly well that Angus was a fraud, but he was a useful fraud. The old man had contacts throughout the Highlands, and his network of gossips made the Curry sisters look like amateurs. He found Angus sitting by his peat fire smoking a foul-smelling pipe. "I've been expecting you." "Hamish Macbeth," Angus intoned in his best mystical voice. "Of course you have," said Hamish dryly. "You've been expecting me since you heard about the murder on the morning news." Angus's wizened face crinkled into a grin. "Aye, well, a man must keep up appearances. What can I do for you?" "I need to know everything there is to know about Alistair Pringle. The real information, not what he told people." Angus puffed on his pipe thoughtfully. "I heard things, you know. Pringle wasn't just a consultant. He was a man who liked having power over people, like digging into their business, finding their secrets." "What kind of secrets?" "Land disputes, mostly. Old deeds, forgotten boundaries, that sort of thing. But I heard he was asking questions about other matters too. Medical records, financial troubles, family scandals." Angus fixed Hamish with a shrewd look. "A man like that makes enemies, Hamish. Lots of enemies." "Aye," said Hamish heavily, "that he does." His final visit of the morning was to Strathbane, where he found Jimmy Anderson in the canteen, nursing a cup of coffee that looked strong enough to strip paint. "Hamish!" Jimmy looked relieved. Thank God for a friendly face. Blair's been on the warpath all morning. Has he arrested Archie yet? Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. The boot prints are a perfect match, and Archie can't account for his whereabouts last night. Jimmy lowered his voice. Between you and me, I don't think he did it. The man's terrified of his own shadow. Never mind committing murder. I need a favour. Oh, Jimmy, I had a feeling you might. Hamish pulled out a bottle of excellent single malt from his jacket pocket. Jimmy's eyes lit up. Is that the Talisker I've heard so much about? Aye, and it's yours if you can get me copies of the autopsy report and the forensics findings. Jimmy hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Blair will have my head if he finds out. Blair won't find out. He's too busy congratulating himself on solving the case. 20 minutes later, Hamish sat in his Land Rover reading through the reports. The autopsy confirmed what Dr. Brodie had already told him. Single blow, death instantaneous, sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning. But the forensics report was more interesting. The murder weapon, the antique Tushkar, had been wiped clean of fingerprints. The killer had been careful, methodical. The blow itself had been delivered with precision and considerable force, suggesting someone who knew exactly where to strike for maximum effect. There were also traces of something else on the handle of the peat cutter. The forensics team had noted it, but hadn't identified it yet. Something adhesive, they thought. Glue of some kind. Hamish sat back, thinking. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was still unclear. His mobile rang. It was Angela Brodie, the doctor's wife, her voice urgent. Hamish, you need to come quickly. There's been a development. He found a small crowd gathered outside the police station. Blair stood on the steps, looking pleased with himself, while 2 constables led Archie McLean to a police car. Archie's face was the colour of old porridge. But I didn't do it, Archie was protesting. I was nowhere near the bog last night. Then how do you explain your boot prints at the murder scene? Blair demanded triumphantly. Hamish pushed through the crowd. Where were you, Archie? Archie's face went even paler. I cannae say, Hamish, I just cannae. Hiding something, are we? Blair crowed. That's as good as a confession. As they drove Archie away, Hamish noticed Mary Sutherland standing at the edge of the crowd, her expression troubled. She caught his eye and shook her head sadly, as if to say what a terrible shame it all was. But Hamish was remembering the scrap of grey fabric in his pocket, and the adhesive traces on the murder weapon, and the way Mary had been so perfectly helpful at exactly the right moments. He walked slowly back to his cottage, where Lugs greeted him with enthusiastic tail wagging. Hamish sat down heavily in his armchair. Something's not right, boy, he said to the dog. Something's not right at all. Outside, the mist continued to roll in from the sea, and somewhere in the village, a killer walked free. Chapter 4, The Blackmailer's Ledger. Hamish spent a sleepless night turning the case over in his mind like a Rubik's cube that refused to align. By dawn, he had made a decision. If Blair was going to charge ahead with Archie McLean as his prime suspect, then Hamish needed to find the real killer before an innocent man went to prison. The problem was access. Blair had already searched Pringle's rented cottage, and the place would be locked up tighter than a drum. Fortunately, Hamish had lived in Lockdube long enough to know that every property in the village had its weaknesses, and he had a friend who knew them all. He found Barney McTavish, the local handyman at the harbour, mending fishing nets. "Barney," said Hamish casually, "you did some work on the Glenview cottage a few months back, didn't you?" Barney looked up, his weathered face creasing into a knowing smile. "Aye, I did. Fixed the plumbing and installed new locks. That's the place that London fellow was renting, is it not? The very same. I don't suppose you kept a spare key. Now, Hamish, you know I always keep spare keys. Can't have folk locked out in an emergency, can we?" Barney wiped his hands on his overalls. "I suppose you'll be needing to conduct official police business?" "Something like that." "Well then, official police business is official police business. I'll just happen to remember I left my best wrench inside and need to fetch it." An hour later, Hamish stood in the sitting room of Glenview Cottage. The Strathbane forensics team had left their usual mess behind, fingerprint powder coating every surface like industrial snow. Pringle's belongings were scattered about. Expensive luggage and designer clothes that spoke of a man who valued appearances. Hamish moved methodically through the rooms. The bedroom yielded nothing but more evidence of Pringle's wealthy lifestyle. The bathroom cabinet contained prescription medications for high blood pressure and heartburn, the elements of a man who lived on stress and rich food. The kitchen was barely used, just a few takeaway containers in the bin. It was in the study that Hamish found what he was looking for, though not where he expected it. A landscape painting hung on the wall, a mediocre watercolour of Ben Nevis that looked like it had come from a hotel clearance sale. But something about it nagged at Hamish's instincts. The frame was too heavy for such a cheap painting, and it hung slightly crooked, as if someone had moved it recently. He lifted it carefully from the wall, and there, set into the plaster, was a small safe. The safe wasn't locked. Blair's team had already forced it open and documented its contents, but in their haste they'd missed something. Behind a bundle of cash and Pringle's passport, Hamish found a leather-bound ledger. He carried it to the desk and began to read. What he found made his blood run cold. Pringle hadn't just been a consultant. He'd been a blackmailer, and a systematic one at that. The ledger was a catalogue of secrets, meticulously documented and cross-referenced. Archie McLean's entry revealed that the Fisherman's Harbour Shed was built on land he didn't technically own, a boundary dispute from the 1950s that had never been properly resolved. Pringle had been threatening to expose this unless Archie paid him a substantial sum. Dr. Brodie's section was worse. 20 years ago, the doctor had made a mistake during a difficult childbirth. The baby had survived, but there had been complications. Pringle had somehow obtained the medical records and was threatening to report Brodie to the medical board, which would have ended his career. The mysterious young man the Curry sisters had seen was identified in the ledger as Callum Pringle, Alistair's nephew. The entry noted that Callum was heavily in debt to gambling creditors in Edinburgh and had been pressuring his uncle for an advance on his inheritance. Alistair had refused, but the ledger included copies of threatening letters Callum had sent. There were other names too. Shopkeepers who'd made minor tax errors, crofters who'd failed to properly register their land transfers. Even the Reverend Wellington was mentioned, though the entry was cryptic, referring only to the incident in Inverness 1982. But it was the final entry that made Hamish pause. It was dated just 3 days ago, and the handwriting was more hurried, as if Pringle had been excited. MS. Finally confirmed. The bog contains what she's been hiding all these years. Family jewellery, possibly worth £50,000 plus. Father's suicide was about more than bankruptcy. She knows I know. This could be the most profitable discovery yet. MS Hamish felt his pulse quicken. Mary Sutherland. He photographed every page of the ledger with his mobile phone, then carefully replaced it in the safe exactly as he had found it. Blair's team would eventually realise its significance, but by then, Hamish hoped to be several steps ahead. As he let himself out of the cottage, he nearly collided with Mary herself, who was walking up the path carrying a basket. "Hamish, you startled me." Her hand flew to her chest, and Hamish noticed it was trembling slightly. "Mrs. Sutherland, I didn't expect to see anyone here. I was bringing some things for the cottage." She held up the basket, showing cleaning supplies and fresh linens. "The landlord asked me to tidy up after the police finished. He's hoping to rent it again soon, once all this unpleasantness is over." She looked at the cottage with sad eyes. Poor Mr. Pringle. Whatever his faults, he didn't deserve such a terrible end. "No," said Hamish carefully. "No one deserves murder. How is poor Archie holding up? I feel just dreadful about giving that list to the inspector. I was only trying to help. But I never imagined they'd arrest him." "Archie's struggling," Hamish admitted, watching her face closely. "He won't say where he was that night, which isn't helping his case." "How frustrating for you," Mary said sympathetically. "You must be working so hard to find the truth." She paused, then added, "I actually wanted to mention something to you. I remembered that Mr. Pringle said he'd been researching the local bog plants for his environmental impact report. He was particularly interested in a rare variety of sphagnum moss that supposedly grew in that area." Hamish felt a small alarm bell ring in the back of his mind. Is that so? Yes, he mentioned it to me at the pub. He seemed quite excited about it. Callistemon sphagnum, I believe he called it. You know a fair bit about plants, do you? Well, I teach nature studies to the children, so I try to keep informed, she smiled modestly. Though I'm hardly an expert. Hamish nodded slowly. Something about this conversation felt wrong, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. I should be getting back to the station. Evidence to review, you know. Of course, I won't keep you. She moved past him toward the cottage, then turned back. Oh, Hamish, I almost forgot. I found something in the library this morning. She reached into her basket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It's a note. I think it might be from Archie. It was tucked inside one of the books on peat cutting, the one next to where the tushkar was displayed. Hamish took the note carefully. It was written on cheap-lined paper in a shaky hand. You'll get what's coming to you, Pringle. Em's touch my shed and you'll regret it. The signature at the bottom read A. McLean. When did you find this? Hamish asked. This morning, when I was reshelving some books. I don't know how the police missed it. Mary's expression was earnest, concerned. I know Archie is your friend, Hamish, but evidence is evidence. I couldn't just ignore it. No, said Hamish quietly. I suppose you couldn't. He drove back to Lockdube in silence, the note burning like acid in his pocket. Everything Mary did seemed helpful, civic-minded, perfectly reasonable, and yet. That afternoon, he sat at his desk and pulled up information about Highland bog plants on his computer. It didn't take long to confirm what his instincts had already told him. There was no such thing as Callistemon sphagnum. Callistemon was a genus of Australian plants, bottle brushes, completely unrelated to sphagnum moss and certainly not native to Scotland. It was the kind of mistake that someone who actually knew about plants would never make. But it was exactly the kind of mistake someone would make if they were trying to sound knowledgeable while actually lying. Hamish sat back in his chair, watching Sonsi clean her whiskers on the windowsill. Mary Sutherland had just made her first real error. She had mentioned a plant that didn't exist, attributed knowledge to Pringle that he couldn't have had, and conveniently produced a threatening note at exactly the right moment to further incriminate Archie. The sweet, helpful schoolteacher was looking less innocent by the hour. Hamish picked up his phone and called Jimmy Anderson. Jimmy, I need you to run a background check for me. Everything you can find on Mary Sutherland. Date of birth, family history, property records, the works. Mary Sutherland, the schoolteacher? Hamish, you can't seriously think... Just do it, Jimmy, and keep it quiet. I have a feeling we're about to discover that Mrs. Sutherland isn't quite the angel she appears to be. Outside, the November afternoon was drawing in, and the mist was rolling up from the sea again, bringing with it the smell of peat smoke and secrets. Chapter 5. Expanding the Suspect Pool. The rain arrived on the third day after the murder, a proper Highland downpour that turned the streets of Lockdube into rivers and sent the sheep huddling miserably against the stone walls. Hamish stood at the window of the police station, watching water stream down the glass and wondering if the weather was trying to wash away evidence or preserve it. His mobile buzzed. It was Jimmy Anderson, his voice low and conspiratorial. I've got that background information you wanted on Mrs. Sutherland. You were right to be curious, Hamish. Her history is complicated. Go on. Born Mary Campbell in 1968, right here in Lockdube. Father was Duncan Campbell, a crofter. Mother died when Mary was young. Duncan lost everything in 1985 during a land dispute. Went bankrupt and hanged himself in his barn. Jimmy paused. The land in question was the peat bog where Pringle was found. Hamish felt the pieces beginning to shift in his mind, like ice breaking up on a frozen loch. Who bought the land? That's where it gets interesting. It was purchased by a development company called Strathcorrie Holdings. The director was a man named Geoffrey Pringle. Alistair's father. The very same. It gets worse, Hamish. According to the court records, Geoffrey Pringle used some questionable legal manoeuvring to force the sale. Duncan Campbell claimed fraud, but he couldn't afford proper representation. Lost everything. Hamish closed his eyes. And Mary has been living here all these years, watching the land that killed her father being used by others. Looks that way. She married a man named Robert Sutherland in 1990, moved away for a bit, came back after he died in a car accident in 1998. She's been teaching at the village school ever since. Patient, Hamish murmured. Very patient. What was that? Nothing, Jimmy. Thanks for the information. One more thing. Can you find out if there have been any recent visitors to the village? Someone who arrived around the same time as Pringle. I'll see what I can dig up. After hanging up, Hamish sat quietly, thinking. The motive was there, clear as day. But motive alone wasn't proof, and he needed more than suspicion to counter Blair's certainty about Archie's guilt. His thoughts were interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw a young man arguing with Dougie Fraser. The stranger wore an expensive suit that looked like it had been slept in, and his dark hair was plastered to his head by the downpour. Hamish grabbed his waterproof jacket and stepped out into the deluge. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" The young man spun around, his face flushed with anger and something else. Fear, perhaps, or desperation. "Are you the police?" Finally, someone official. "I've been trying to get information about my uncle for 2 days, and everyone in this god-forsaken village acts like I'm the plague." "Your uncle?" "Alistair Pringle. I'm Callum Pringle from Edinburgh." He ran a hand through his wet hair. "I heard about his death on the news. I've been trying to see him, to speak to someone in charge, but the local hotel won't even give me a room." Hamish studied him carefully. This was the mysterious young man the Curry sisters had seen arguing with Alistair. Up close, Callum had the look of someone living on his nerves, all jittery energy and barely controlled panic. "Perhaps you'd better come inside, Mr. Pringle. We can talk out of the rain." In the police station, with a towel and a cup of hot tea, Callum gradually calmed down enough to tell his story. It wasn't a pretty one. "I'm in trouble," he admitted, staring into his cup. "Gambling debts, serious ones. I owed some very nasty people a lot of money, and they weren't the patient type." "So you came to your uncle for help?" "He was my only living relative. My father and he had a falling out years ago, but I thought, blood is blood, you know. He had money, he could afford to help me." Callum's laugh was bitter. "I should have known better. Uncle Alistair didn't believe in charity, not even for family." "When did you arrive in Lochdu?" 3 days before he died. I'd been staying at a bed and breakfast in Strathbane, working up the courage to confront him. When I finally did, he laughed in my face, said I was a wastrel and a fool, and he wouldn't throw good money after bad. "The Curry sisters saw you arguing with him by the harbour." Callum nodded miserably. "I begged him. Actually begged. It was humiliating. He just walked away, told me to grow up and face the consequences of my actions." "Where were you the night he died?" "Driving back to Edinburgh. I gave up, figured I'd have to work something else out with my creditors." He pulled out his mobile phone, scrolling through screens. "I've got receipts from the petrol station on the A9. Time stamped at 11:45 that night. I was 50 miles away when he was killed." Hamish examined the receipts. Unless Callum had an accomplice or had somehow managed to be in 2 places at once, his alibi appeared solid. "I know how this looks," Callum said quietly. "Desperate man, refused inheritance, victim turns up dead. But I didn't kill him. I'm not saying I'm sorry he's gone, mind you. Uncle Alistair was a thoroughly unpleasant man, but I didn't kill him." After Callum left, heading back to his car with directions to a hotel in the next village, Hamish added him to his mental list of suspects with solid alibis. The list was getting uncomfortably long. The afternoon brought another visitor. Dr. Brodie arrived at the station looking deeply uncomfortable, his round face creased with worry. "Hamish, I need to speak with you, confidentially." "Come in, doctor. Can I offer you some tea? Something stronger, if you have it." Hamish poured 2 small measures of whiskey and waited. Dr. Brodie took a fortifying sip before speaking. "I'm in serious trouble, Hamish. That man Pringle, he knew about the Macpherson baby." "The difficult delivery 20 years ago?" Dr. Brodie's head snapped up. You know about it? I'm investigating a murder, Doctor. I know about a lot of things. It was a nightmare, Dr. Brodie said quietly. Mrs. Macpherson was having complications, the baby was breech, and we were too far from hospital. I did my best, but there was damage. The child survived, but there were developmental delays. The family never blamed me. They understood I'd done everything possible under terrible circumstances, but technically, there were procedures I should have followed differently. And Pringle was threatening to report you. He wanted money, £5,000 to keep quiet, said if I didn't pay, he'd make sure the medical board reviewed the case. The doctor's hand shook as he set down his glass. I couldn't afford it, Hamish, and I couldn't face losing my licence. I've spent my whole life serving this community. Where were you the night Pringle died? Playing cards at the manse with Reverend Wellington. We meet every Tuesday evening. The Reverend will vouch for me. Dr. Brodie met Hamish's eyes. I didn't kill him, Hamish. I won't pretend I'm not relieved he's dead, but I didn't do it. I believe you, Hamish said gently. But I need you to be straight with me, Doctor. Is there anything else I should know? The doctor hesitated, then shook his head. Nothing relevant to the murder, just, well, I may have been doing a bit of salmon fishing in areas where I technically shouldn't have been, but that's hardly murder. After the doctor left, Hamish walked down to the harbour through the rain. Archie McLean's wife, a formidable woman with a voice like a foghorn, was haranguing anyone who would listen about her husband's innocence. He was with me all night, she bellowed at a group of wet tourists. In the pub cellar, hiding like a scared rabbit because he's too much of a coward to come home and face his responsibilities. Hamish approached carefully. Mrs. McLean in full flow was a force of nature that sensible men avoided. Mrs. McLean, I need to speak with you about Archie's whereabouts. She rounded on him, her eyes blazing. Finally, someone who wants to hear the truth. My useless husband was hiding in the cellar of that pub from 10 o'clock until 4 in the morning, drinking whiskey and avoiding me. The landlord can confirm it, so can 3 other regulars who were playing cards down there. He was there the whole time. I, the coward! And now he's locked up for a murder he didn't commit while I'm left to manage everything alone. Hamish made his escape as quickly as possible, but Mrs. McLean's words confirmed what he'd already suspected. Archie McLean had a solid alibi, witnessed by multiple people. Blair had arrested the wrong man. That evening Hamish sat in his cottage making notes while Luggs snored at his feet and Sonsie watched the rain from the window. His list of suspects was shrinking rapidly. Archie McLean, alibi confirmed by multiple witnesses. Callum Pringle, alibied by petrol station receipts and traffic cameras. Dr. Brodie, alibied by Reverend Wellington. Which left the question, if none of the obvious suspects had killed Pringle, who had? His mobile buzzed with a text from Mary Sutherland. Dear Hamish, I've made a batch of cockaliki soup. Would you like some? I could drop it by the station tomorrow. You must be working so hard on this terrible case. Mary. Hamish stared at the text for a long moment. Sweet, helpful Mary. Always there with food and comfort and perfectly timed assistance. Mary, whose father had lost his land to Pringle's father. Mary, who knew the bogs better than anyone from her childhood. Mary, who made subtle mistakes when she tried to sound too helpful. He texted back, That would be lovely, thank you. But his mind was already working, just connecting the threads, seeing the pattern emerging from the chaos. Tomorrow, he thought, he would start looking much more carefully at the helpful schoolteacher with the tragic past and the impeccable manners. Tomorrow, he would start setting a trap. Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. The soup arrived the next morning in a proper tureen, still steaming, with fresh bread wrapped in a checked cloth. Mary delivered it herself, her smile warm despite the cold wind blowing in from the sea. You look exhausted, Hamish, she said, setting the basket on his desk. Have you been sleeping at all? Not much, Hamish admitted, which was the truth. He'd spent half the night reviewing everything he knew about the case, looking for the one thread that would unravel the whole tapestry. Well, you must eat properly at least. Can't have our village constable wasting away. She glanced around the station. taking in the scattered papers and empty coffee cups. "Is there anything I can do to help? I have some free time this afternoon." "That's kind of you." "But I've got it under control." After she left, Hamish stared at the soup for a long moment before pouring it down the sink. It was probably perfectly safe, but he'd learned long ago that when you suspected someone of murder, you didn't eat their cooking. Luggs looked at him reproachfully as the aromatic broth disappeared down the drain. "Sorry, boy," Hamish muttered. "But better safe than sorry." He spent the morning reviewing Archie McLean's case file, looking for anything that might convince Blair to release the fisherman. The boot prints were damning, certainly, but they only proved that Archie had been near the bog at some point, not necessarily at the time of the murder. The threatening note that Mary had found was more problematic, but something about it nagged at Hamish's instincts. He pulled it out and examined it under his desk lamp. The paper was cheap, the kind you could buy at any shop in the Highlands, but the handwriting, while shaky, seemed almost too perfectly shaky, if that made sense. As if someone had been trying very hard to make their writing look unsteady. His phone rang. It was the desk sergeant from Strathbane. "Macbeth? We've got your friend Archie here throwing a fit. Says he needs to speak to you urgently. Won't say what it's about, but he's making enough noise to wake the dead." "Put him on." There was a scuffling sound, then Archie's voice high with panic. "Hamish, you have to get me out of here. It's my boat, you see. If I'm not there to tend to it, and with this weather coming in—" "Archie, I can't just release you. Blair has you in custody." "But my boat! My livelihood!" "Can you at least check on it? Make sure it's properly moored? Please, Hamish, I'm begging you." Hamish sighed. "Aye, I'll check on it. Try to stay calm, Archie. We'll get this sorted." The harbour was deserted when Hamish arrived, the fishing boats bobbing on the choppy water like a flotilla of ducks. Archie's boat, the Sea Spray, was easy to spot. It was also perfectly secure, tied with knots that would have held in a hurricane. Hamish was about to leave when he noticed Dr. Brodie's car parked near the harbour master's office. That was odd. The doctor usually made his house calls in the mornings and spent his afternoons at the surgery. Curious, Hamish followed a muddy path that led toward the old fish processing shed. The building had been abandoned for years, its windows broken and its walls covered in graffiti. But there was a light inside, visible through the cracks in the door. Hamish approached quietly, years of Highland poaching experience making his footsteps silent on the wet ground. Through a gap in the wood, he could see Dr. Brodie inside, bent over something on the floor. "Dr. Brodie," Hamish called out, "is everything all right?" The doctor shot upright like a startled deer. In his hands was a bloody burlap sack. For a moment they stared at each other. Then Dr. Brodie's shoulders slumped. "Oh, bloody hell," he said wearily. "You'd better come in, Hamish." Inside the shed, Hamish examined the contents of the sack. It was a salmon, a beauty of a fish that must have weighed 15 pounds. It was also quite definitely poached from Lord Strathcorrie's river, which made it highly illegal. "I can explain," Dr. Brodie began. "I'm sure you can," Hamish said dryly, "though I'm curious why you're burying evidence in an abandoned fish shed at midnight." "It's not midnight, it's 2 in the afternoon. You know what I mean." Dr. Brodie sat down heavily on an old crate. "I caught it last week. Meant to eat it straight away, but then all this business with Pringle happened and I forgot about it. By the time I remembered, it had gone off. I couldn't just throw it in the bin, could I? My wife would have seen it and demanded to know where it came from. She's very particular about obeying the law. So you were going to bury it here? Seemed like the sensible thing to do." Hamish looked at the doctor, at the ridiculous sack, at the absurdity of the whole situation. Then he started to laugh. "It's not funny," Dr. Brodie protested, but his lips were twitching. "Oh, but it is," Hamish said, wiping his eyes. "Here I was, thinking I'd caught you disposing of murder evidence, and instead you're burying a rotten salmon to hide it from your wife. You won't report it," Hamish considered. By the strict letter of the law, he should confiscate the fish and fine the doctor for poaching. But the strict letter of the law had never been Hamish's strong suit, and besides, Dr. Brodie was a good man who served the community faithfully. A bit of poaching was a Highland tradition, not a hanging offence. I saw nothing, Hamish said firmly. But Dr. Brodie, do me a favour. Next time you fancy a bit of salmon, buy it from the fishmonger like everyone else. You have my word. They buried the fish together, and Hamish walked back to his Land Rover feeling lighter than he had in days. At least one mystery had been solved, even if it was the wrong one. That evening he decided to take a walk through the village, partly to clear his head and partly to see what he could observe. The rain had stopped, leaving everything washed clean and gleaming in the late afternoon light. He found himself near the village library, a small stone building that also housed the local history society's collection. On impulse, he went inside. The librarian, a shy woman named Fiona, looked up from her desk. "Evening, Hamish. Looking for anything in particular?" "Just browsing. I heard you had a heritage display here. Traditional Highland tools and such." "Aye, we did. Well, we still do, but it's a bit depleted now." She gestured to a glass case near the window. The police took several items as evidence, including our lovely old tush car. Hamish examined the empty space where the peat cutter had been displayed. "Who has access to this case?" "Oh, it's not locked. We're a trusting community. Anyone could have taken something if they wanted to." Fiona paused. "Though Mary Sutherland is here most often. She manages the historical collection for us, knows every item we have." "Does she now?" "Oh, yes. She's been wonderful about cataloguing everything, writing up the histories, very dedicated to preserving the village heritage." Hamish thanked her and left, his mind working. Mary would have known exactly where the Tushkar was, would have had easy access to it, could have taken it without anyone noticing. And she would have known how to use it properly too from her childhood when peat cutting was still common. He was so lost in thought that he nearly walked into Angela Brodie, the doctor's wife, who was coming out of the shop laden with groceries. "Hamish, just the man I wanted to see. I've been meaning to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For whatever you said to my husband. He's been so much more relaxed these past few days. I think he was worried about that Pringle business, you know, with the medical records and all." She smiled. "I told him he was being silly, that no one could blame him for what happened all those years ago. But he does worry so." Hamish helped her carry her bags to her car. "Mrs. Brodie, what can you tell me about Mary Sutherland?" "Mary? Oh, she's lovely. Very quiet, very dedicated to her students." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. Has she always lived in Lochdew?" "Well, no. She grew up here. Left when she married. Came back after her husband died. Must have been nearly 30 years ago now that she left. I remember because it was just after that terrible business with Duncan Campbell. You knew her father. Everyone knew Duncan. Lovely man, but so tragic. Lost everything to that awful property developer, then took his own life." Angela shook her head. "Mary found him, poor thing. Can you imagine? Just a young girl finding her father like that." After Angela drove off, Hamish stood in the empty street, watching the last light fade from the sky. Mary had found her father's body, had lived with that trauma for decades, had watched strangers profit from the land that had destroyed her family, and then Alistair Pringle, son of the man who'd caused it all, had come back to exploit that same land. Hamish could almost understand it, could almost sympathise. But understanding a motive didn't mean excusing murder, and sympathy didn't mean letting a killer go free. He walked slowly back to the police station, where Luggs and Sonsi waited, and spent the rest of the evening planning his next move. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. Hamish spent the next morning doing what he did best, talking to people, not interrogating them in the aggressive Blair style, all shouting and threats, but simply chatting over cups of tea and whiskey, letting conversations meander where they would. It was amazing what people told you when they didn't realise they were being questioned. His first stop was the Lochdew pub, where the landlord, Watty Morrison, was wiping down glasses with the methodical attention of a man who'd been doing it for 40 years. "Watty, I need to ask you about the night Pringle died. Archie McLean says he was here." Watty's weathered face creased into a grimace. "Aye, the poor fool was hiding in my cellar like a rabbit down a hole. Arrived around 10 o'clock, already half cut, muttering about his wife and needing peace. How long was he there? All bloody night. Him and 3 others were playing cards down there until near dawn. I had to practically throw them out when I opened up the next morning. You're certain about the times? Certain as I can be. I locked up at midnight like always, and they were still at it. I heard them bumping about down there until at least 3. Watty set down his glass. Archie's many things, Hamish, but he's no murderer. Too soft, that one. Can he even face his own wife, never mind bash a man's head in? Hamish's next visit was to the manse, where he found Reverend Wellington in his study, surrounded by books and sermon notes. The Reverend was a kind man with infinite patience for human failings, which made him an excellent minister and a reliable witness. Doctor, Brodie was here that evening. Yes, the Reverend confirmed, offering Hamish a seat. We play cribbage every Tuesday, have done for years. He arrived at 8 and didn't leave until well after midnight. You're certain about the time? Absolutely. We were watching the news at 11. I remember commenting on a story about the Highland Games. Dr. Brodie was still here then, and we played another few hands before he finally went home. Must have been 12:30 at least. Did he seem agitated at all? Worried? The Reverend considered this carefully. He seemed preoccupied, perhaps, but then we all were. That Pringle fellow had upset the entire village with his schemes. I myself was troubled by the situation. He paused. But Dr. Brodie is a good man, Hamish. Whatever his worries, he wouldn't resort to violence. By lunchtime, Hamish had confirmed what he'd already suspected. Every obvious suspect had an alibi that was either rock solid or backed by multiple witnesses who had no reason to lie. He sat in his Land Rover eating a sandwich and watching the village go about its business. A group of schoolchildren ran past, their voices bright with laughter, and Hamish recognised Mary's gentle influence in their good manners. She really was an excellent teacher, which made what he had to do all the more difficult. His phone rang. It was Jimmy Anderson, and he sounded excited. Hamish, I've been going through the forensics reports again. That adhesive they found on the murder weapon, the lab finally identified it. Go on. It's archival glue, the kind used in document preservation. Very specific composition, not something you'd find in ordinary household use. Where would you get it? Libraries, museums, historical societies. Anywhere that deals with old documents and needs to preserve them. Hamish felt his pulse quicken. The village library. Exactly. And guess who manages the historical collection there? Mrs. Sutherland. There's more. I had a word with the forensics team about that scrap of fabric you found. The grey wool. It's been analysed. High-quality merino, hand-knitted, probably from a cardigan or jumper. The dye lot matches a batch sold exclusively through a craft shop in Inverness about 3 years ago. Can you trace the purchase? Already did. The shop keeps detailed records for their bespoke orders. One Mary Sutherland purchased 3 skeins of that exact wool in October 3 years ago. Said she was making a cardigan for herself. Hamish closed his eyes. The evidence was mounting, piece by careful piece. But evidence wasn't the same as proof, and he still needed to understand exactly how and why the murder had happened. That afternoon, he drove out to the peat bog alone. The crime scene tape had been removed, and the area looked peaceful in the weak sunlight. Hamish walked the path from the road to the cutting, where Pringle's body had been found, counting his steps, noting the terrain. It was treacherous ground, even in daylight. Deep pools of black water lurked beneath innocent-looking vegetation. Soft patches that could swallow a man's leg to the knee. Hidden rocks that could turn an ankle in an instant. Yet the killer had navigated this maze in total darkness without a torch, had reached the exact spot, had delivered a single killing blow, and had made it back to safety without leaving any evidence except boot prints that pointed to someone else. That took knowledge. Intimate, detailed knowledge of every inch of this ground. Hamish stood in the cutting and looked around. From here, you couldn't see the road or any buildings. It was utterly isolated, a pocket of wilderness in the midst of civilization. The perfect spot for a murder, if you knew it was here. He bent down and examined the ground carefully. The police had taken samples of everything, but Hamish had learned to look for what others missed. And there, caught on a small piece of heather, was another tiny scrap of fabric. Grey wool, so small it was almost invisible. He bagged it carefully and continued his search. Near the edge of the cutting, half buried in peat, he found something else, a button. Small, carved from horn, the kind used on expensive knitwear. Hamish sat back on his heels thinking. The killer had been here more than once. These weren't just fragments left during the murder. They suggested someone who had been visiting this spot regularly, perhaps planning, perhaps simply remembering. His phone buzzed with a text from Mary. "Dear Hamish, I'm organising a memorial service for Mr. Pringle at the school. It seems the proper thing to do, regardless of his behaviour. Would you say a few words? I know it's a lot to ask. Mary." Hamish stared at the text for a long moment. Even now Mary was maintaining her role as the village's moral compass, doing the proper thing, being helpful and kind. He texted back, "Of course. When is it?" The response came quickly. "Tomorrow evening at 7. Thank you so much, Hamish. You're a good man." That evening Hamish made one final visit. He went to the village library and asked Fiona if he could examine the Historical Society's records. "Of course, Hamish. Mary keeps everything meticulously organised. What are you looking for?" "I'm not entirely sure." He spent 2 hours going through boxes of documents, photographs and artefacts. The history of Lochdoub was laid out before him in fading ink and yellowed paper. Property deeds, birth certificates, marriage records, death notices. And there, in a file marked Campbell family, he found it. A series of photographs from the 1980s. A younger Mary, perhaps 17, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes. Her father, Duncan Campbell. They were standing in front of the very peat bog where Pringle had died. In the margins of one photograph, someone had written in neat script, "Our land, our heritage, never forget." The handwriting matched the cataloguing notes throughout the historical collection. Mary's handwriting. Hamish carefully photographed the documents with his phone, then returned everything to its proper place. As he was leaving, Fiona called out to him. "Did you find what you needed?" "Aye," Hamish said quietly. "I'm afraid I did." That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed with Luggs snoring beside him, and Sonsy purring on his chest, staring at the ceiling and thinking about justice and vengeance and the fine line between the two. Mary Sutherland had every reason to hate Alistair Pringle. His father had destroyed her family. He had driven her father to suicide, stolen her inheritance. And Alistair himself had come to profit further from that theft, had discovered her secret, had threatened to expose her. In her position, Hamish thought, many people would have wanted Pringle dead. But wanting and doing were different things, and the law, even Highland law bent to accommodate human nature, couldn't excuse murder. Tomorrow there would be a memorial service. Tomorrow Mary would stand before the village, playing her role as the gentle, caring teacher. Tomorrow Hamish would have to decide exactly how to proceed. He thought about Blair, so eager to close the case with Archie's arrest. He thought about the real killer who had planned and executed a perfect murder, whose only mistake had been being too helpful, too present, too perfect. Finally, near dawn, Hamish made his decision. He would confront Mary, but he would do it carefully, quietly, and in a way that might still preserve some dignity in the midst of tragedy. Because that, after all, was the Highland way. Chapter 8. The Schoolteacher's Flaw. The memorial service was held in the school gymnasium, a draughty space that smelled of floor polish and old plimsolls. Someone had made an effort with flowers and candles, though Hamish suspected the gesture was more for show than genuine mourning. Nobody in Lochdoub had liked Alistair Pringle enough to grieve him. Hamish stood at the back, watching people file in with the dutiful expressions of those attending a funeral out of obligation rather than sorrow. Mary stood near the door, greeting everyone with her characteristic gentle warmth, accepting condolences as if she'd actually lost someone dear. She wore a grey cardigan over a simple black dress. The cardigan was hand-knitted, beautiful work, the kind that took hours of patient effort. Hamish noted that one button was missing from the front. When she saw him, her face brightened. "Hamish, thank you so much for coming, and for agreeing to speak." "It's no trouble," he said, studying her carefully. Up close, he could see the strain around her eyes, the tightness in her smile that suggested sleepless nights. Guilty conscience, or simply the stress of maintaining her charade? The service was mercifully brief. Reverend Wellington said appropriate words about the tragedy of violence and the importance of community. Dr. Brodie spoke about the sanctity of life, though his heart clearly wasn't in it. When it was Hamish's turn, he kept his remarks short and neutral, talking about justice and truth without saying anything that might alert Mary to his suspicions. Afterward, as people milled about drinking tea and eating biscuits, Hamish found himself standing beside Mary near the refreshment table. "That was very kind of you," she said softly. "I know Mr. Pringle wasn't a popular man, but everyone deserves to be remembered with dignity." "Aye," Hamish agreed. "Tell me, Mrs. Sutherland, did Pringle ever mention his research to you? The environmental survey he was supposedly conducting?" "Oh yes, he talked about it at the pub that night. He was quite passionate about the bog's ecology, mentioned several plant species he'd found." "Such as?" "Well, the Callistemon sphagnum for one. He seemed quite excited about discovering it growing wild." Hamish kept his expression neutral. "That must have been interesting." "Indeed. I told him I'd be happy to help with his botanical survey if he needed assistance. I do teach the children about local flora, after all." "I'm sure you do," Hamish said mildly. "It's just that I looked into that particular plant. Callistemon sphagnum doesn't exist. Callistemon is an Australian genus, completely unrelated to sphagnum moss." He watched the colour drain from Mary's face, then return in a bright flush. "How silly of me," she said quickly. "I must have misheard him. Perhaps he said something else entirely. It was quite noisy in the pub that evening." "Perhaps," Hamish said. "Or perhaps someone who actually knew about plants wouldn't make that mistake at all. Unless they were trying to create the impression that Pringle had been researching the bog when he actually hadn't been." Mary's hand trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. "I don't understand what you're suggesting, Hamish." "Don't you? Let me tell you what I think happened, Mrs. Sutherland. I think Pringle discovered something about you and your family, something to do with that bog where he died." "I really should circulate among the guests," Mary said, her voice tight. "People will wonder—" "The forensics team found archival glue on the murder weapon," Hamish continued, his voice low and conversational. "The same kind of glue you use for preserving historical documents. They also found fragments of grey wool, hand-knitted, high-quality merino, from a cardigan just like the one you're wearing now, the one that's missing a button." Mary looked down at her cardigan, as if seeing it for the first time. Her fingers moved to the gap where the button should have been. "I lost that button weeks ago," she whispered. "Did you?" "'Cause I found one near the murder scene. Horn, carved, exactly matching the one still on your cardigan." Hamish paused. "You've been to that spot many times, haven't you? Long before Pringle died. It was your family's land once." For a long moment, Mary said nothing. Then she lifted her chin, and Hamish saw something shift in her expression. The sweet, gentle schoolteacher facade slipped, just for an instant, and he glimpsed the steel beneath. "I need some air," she said quietly. "Would you walk with me, Hamish?" They left the gymnasium together, walking through the school corridors hung with children's artwork, and past the classrooms where Mary had taught generations of Lochdoob's young. Outside, the evening was cool and clear, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "How did you know?" Mary asked finally. "Little things. You were too helpful, and too perfectly present at every crucial moment. You made mistakes trying to sound knowledgeable about things Pringle supposedly said. The threatening note you found was too convenient, too perfectly timed." Hamish glanced at her. "And you knew the bogs too well. Only someone who'd grown up there could have navigated that path in the dark." They reached the harbour and stood looking out at the black water. "My father loved that land," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. It had been in our family for generations. He would take me out there as a child and tell me stories about our ancestors, about how they'd survived on what the bog provided. Peat for warmth, plants for medicine. It was our heritage. And Geoffrey Pringle took it from him. He didn't just take it, he destroyed my father with it. Used legal tricks and false debts to force a sale at a fraction of its value. My father tried to fight, but he had no money for lawyers, no powerful friends. Her hands gripped the railing. When he realised he had lost everything, that we'd be thrown out of our home with nothing, he couldn't bear it. I found him in the barn. I was 17 years old. Hamish said nothing, letting her talk. I left Lockdube after that. Married, tried to build a new life. But when my husband died, I came back. This was still my home, you see, and I wanted to be near that land even if I couldn't own it anymore. She turned to look at him. For 30 years I walked that bog. I knew every pool, every path, every hidden danger. I watched others profit from what should have been mine. And then Alistair Pringle arrived. Geoffrey's son. It felt like a curse. He was just like his father. Arrogant, greedy, cruel, and he'd found out about the jewellery. The jewellery your father hid in the bog, Mary nodded. Just a few pieces my grandmother had left me. Father buried them there to keep them from the creditors. He told me where before he died, but I never retrieved them. I couldn't bear to dig in that cursed place. She laughed bitterly. And then Pringle found the records somehow, probably going through old court documents for his land survey. He knew about the jewellery, knew it was still there, knew I'd never claimed it. He was blackmailing you. He threatened to report me for theft if I didn't pay him half its value, said he'd make sure everyone knew the respected schoolteacher was really a thief who'd hidden stolen assets. Her voice hardened. I couldn't let him destroy my reputation. This teaching position is all I have, Hamish. These children, this community, it's all I've built from the ruins of my life. So you killed him. Mary met his eyes steadily. I'm not going to confess to something I didn't do, Hamish, but I will say this. If someone did kill Alistair Pringle, they probably felt they were righting an old wrong, delivering justice that the law never provided. That's not how justice works, Mrs. Sutherland, isn't it? Where was justice when my father lost everything? Where was justice when a 17-year-old girl found her father hanging in a barn? Where was justice for 30 years of watching others profit from theft? She shook her head. The law failed my family, Hamish. Saul failed us completely. Hamish looked at her and saw not a sweet schoolteacher, but a woman who'd been broken young and had spent a lifetime hiding her scars behind a gentle smile. I need to think about this, he said finally. But Mrs. Sutherland, I want you to know that I understand. I understand more than you might think. What will you do? What I always do. My job. He walked back to the police station alone, leaving Mary standing by the harbour, a small figure silhouetted against the dark water. Tomorrow he would have to make a decision. Tomorrow he would have to choose between the law and Highland justice, between what was legal and what was right. Tonight, though, he would simply think, and perhaps have a dram of whisky while he did. Chapter 9. Sins of the Past. Hamish didn't sleep well that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mary's face at the harbour, saw the pain and anger that had finally broken through her carefully maintained composure. He understood her rage. In her position, he might have felt the same way. But understanding didn't change the facts. A man was dead, and someone had to answer for it. At dawn, he gave up on sleep and took Lugs for a long walk along the beach. The dog seemed to sense his mood and stayed close, occasionally pressing against his leg as if offering comfort. "What do I do, boy?" Hamish asked the empty shore. "The law says one thing, but justice says another." Lugs had no answer, which was probably for the best. Back at the station, Hamish made coffee and spread out everything he'd gathered on his desk. The photographs from the library, the forensic reports, the timeline he'd constructed, and in the centre of it all the question that had been nagging at him since his conversation with Mary. Why the peat bog? Why that specific spot? He pulled up property records on his computer, tracing the land's history back through decades of transfers and sales. The Campbell family had owned it from 1847 until 1985, when Geoffrey Pringle's company had acquired it through what the records euphemistically called foreclosure proceedings. But there was something else in the files. A geological survey from 1983 commissioned by Duncan Campbell himself. Hamish read through the technical language until he found what he was looking for. The bog contained a small deposit of rare earth minerals, nothing commercially viable in the 1980s, but today, with modern extraction methods and the demand for such materials in electronics, it could be worth a considerable sum. Geoffrey Pringle must have known about it, must have engineered the foreclosure specifically to gain access to those minerals, and Alistair, going through his father's papers after the old man's death, would have found the surveys and realised what his father had stolen. Hamish sat back, the full picture finally coming into focus. His phone rang. It was Jimmy Anderson, sounding harried. "Hamish, Blair's having kittens. The evidence against Archie is falling apart. The boot prints could have been left any time in the days before the murder, and that threatening note has apparently been examined by a handwriting expert who says it's likely a forgery." "Is that so?" "Blair's looking for someone else to arrest, and fast. He's making noises about bringing in every crofter who had a dispute with Pringle." Jimmy lowered his voice. "You need to give him something, Hamish. Someone, or he's going to tear Loughdoob apart." After hanging up, Hamish sat staring at the wall. Blair would be arriving soon, bellowing and threatening, making everyone's life miserable in his determination to close the case. And unless Hamish gave him the real killer, innocent people would suffer. He thought about Mary, about her quiet dedication to the village children, her gentle kindness to everyone she met. She had built a good life from terrible tragedy, had served her community faithfully for decades, but she'd also committed murder. Premeditated, carefully planned murder. Hamish made his decision. He drove to the village library and asked Fiona if he could see the heritage collection one more time. "Of course, Hamish. Mary's in the back room if you need her help with anything." He found Mary cataloguing a box of old photographs, her hands steady, her expression calm. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment their eyes met. "You've come to arrest me," she said quietly. "I've come to understand," Hamish replied. "Tell me about the jewellery, Mrs. Sutherland, the real story." Mary set down the photograph she'd been holding. "It wasn't just my grandmother's jewellery, it was evidence." "Evidence of what?" "Of the fraud. Geoffrey Pringle had given my father a receipt for a loan payment that was never actually made. Father kept it in his mother's jewellery box. When he realised Pringle was going to bankrupt us anyway, he buried the whole box in the bog. The jewellery, the receipt, letters that proved Pringle had lied about the loan amounts. Why didn't he use it to fight the foreclosure? He tried, but the box disappeared before the court date. Father thought Pringle had found it somehow, had taken it. He gave up after that. Thought there was no point fighting any more." Mary's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "But the box was still there. I found it last year when I was walking the bog paths. 30 years later, everything exactly where Father had left it. And Alistair discovered you had it? He was clever, I'll give him that. He'd been researching the property records and found references to the jewellery in the bankruptcy proceedings. When he realised I'd never claimed it, never sold it, he knew I must still have access to it. He confronted me, threatened to expose me as a thief unless I gave him half its value." She smiled without humour. "But it wasn't the jewellery he really wanted. It was the documents, the proof of his father's fraud. He wanted to destroy the evidence that could have saved your father. More than that, if those documents came to light, the land sale could potentially be challenged. Everything the Pringles had built on that theft could come crashing down." Mary folded her hands. "Alistair couldn't allow that. So he offered me a deal. Give him the documents to destroy, pay him for his silence, and we'd both walk away. But you didn't want to walk away." "No," she said softly. "I didn't." They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the accumulated history of Loughdoob. by the records of births and deaths and all the small dramas in between. "Where are the documents now?" Hamish asked. "Safe, hidden where they can do some good." She met his eyes. "I'm not sorry, Hamish. I know I should be, but I'm not. Alistair Pringle was going to destroy the only proof of what his father did. He was going to continue profiting from theft and fraud. I couldn't let that happen." "So you killed him?" "I stopped him," Mary corrected. "There's a difference." Hamish stood up slowly. "Mrs. Sutherland, I need those documents, and I need you to come with me to the police station. To confess. To tell your story. All of it. The fraud, the blackmail, everything." He paused. "And then we're going to let Detective Chief Inspector Blair solve this case his way." Mary looked confused. "Oh, I don't understand." "You will," Hamish said. "Trust me." An hour later, Hamish had the documents spread across his desk. The receipt for the phantom loan payment, letters in Geoffrey Pringle's handwriting admitting to falsifying records, a geological survey showing the mineral deposits, everything needed to prove that the Pringle family had stolen the Campbell land through fraud. He also had Mary's knitting bag, which she had brought at his request. Inside, carefully placed where Blair's detectives couldn't possibly miss them, were the murder weapon cleaning cloth and a detailed timeline in Mary's handwriting, planning the perfect murder. His phone rang. It was the desk sergeant from Strathbane. "Macbeth? Blair's on his way to you. Says he's going to solve this case today if it kills him. Thought you'd want a heads up." "Thanks," Hamish said. "I appreciate it." He looked at Mary, who sat quietly in the corner of his office, her hands folded in her lap. "When Blair arrives," Hamish said carefully, "he's going to search this station. He's going to find evidence that points to you. Evidence he'll think he discovered through his own brilliant detective work. And the fraud documents will be found at the same time. Blair will have to acknowledge them as part of the investigation." Hamish sat down across from her. "Here's what's going to happen, Mrs. Sutherland. Blair will arrest you. You'll be charged with murder. But those documents will prove motive, will show the context, will demonstrate what the Pringle family did to yours." "That won't change the fact that I killed him." "No," Hamish agreed. "But it will change how the jury sees it. Might even change the sentence. And more importantly, it will expose the fraud. The land might be returned to its rightful heir. Me? Aye, if you're still alive to inherit it." Mary was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, really smiled, for the first time since he'd known her. "You're a good man, Hamish Macbeth, even if you are a policeman." Outside, Hamish heard the roar of Blair's car pulling up. The game was almost over. Now came the tricky part. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. Detective Chief Inspector Blair burst through the door of the Lochdew police station like a bull that had spotted a particularly offensive red flag. His face was purple, his breathing laboured, and he smelled of the whiskey he'd been drinking since breakfast. "Right then, Macbeth," he bellowed. "I've had enough of your dithering and incompetence. I'm taking over this investigation personally." "Of course, sir," Hamish said mildly, stepping aside. "I've been doing my best, but I'm just a simple village constable." Blair's eyes narrowed with suspicion at this uncharacteristic meekness, but his need to assert dominance won out. "Where's that fisherman, McLean? I want him back in custody." "I'm afraid the evidence against Archie has fallen apart, sir. The handwriting expert confirmed the threatening note was a forgery, and the boot prints don't prove anything." "Then who killed Pringle?" Blair demanded. Hamish gestured vaguely around the station. "I've been going through the evidence again, sir. Perhaps you'd like to examine it yourself? Fresh eyes and all that." Blair needed no further encouragement. He began rifling through the papers on Hamish's desk with the delicacy of a badger digging for grubs. Jimmy Anderson arrived a few minutes later, gave Hamish a questioning look, and received a subtle nod in return. It didn't take long. Blair was many things, but observant wasn't one of them. However, when evidence was placed directly in his path with all the subtlety of a neon sign, even he couldn't miss it. "What's this?" Blair pulled Mary's knitting bag from beneath the desk where Hamish had strategically positioned it. Inside were cleaning cloths that forensics would later confirm contained traces of Pringle's blood, along with a small notebook detailing times, routes, and methods. "That's Mrs. Sutherland's bag, sir," Hamish said. "She must have left it here after the memorial service." Blair's face transformed from confusion to triumph in an instant. "Anderson, get forensics on this immediately." He turned to Mary, who sat quietly in the corner. "Mrs. Sutherland, I'm afraid I need to ask you some questions." "Of course, Inspector," Mary said calmly. "Though I should tell you, I've been expecting this." Over the next hour, Blair conducted what he believed was a masterful interrogation. Hamish and Jimmy stood to one side, Daz watching as the detective built his case piece by piece, never realising that every revelation had been carefully laid out for him like breadcrumbs leading to gingerbread. The archival glue matched the supplies in the library. The grey wool matched Mary's cardigan. The button found at the scene was identical to the ones on her clothing, and most damning of all, the notebook contained detailed plans for navigating the bog in darkness, timing the murder for maximum isolation, and using the traditional peat cutter as both weapon and symbol. "Why?" Blair demanded, his moment of glory making him almost eloquent. "Why kill him?" "Because of what his father did to mine," Mary said quietly. "And because of what he was planning to do." "I don't care about ancient history," Blair began, but Jimmy interrupted. "Sir, there's more here. Documents, old property records, letters." Blair snatched them impatiently, then stopped as he began to read. Even his whiskey-fogged brain could grasp the significance of what he was holding. "This is proof of fraud," he said slowly. "The Pringle family defrauded Mrs. Sutherland's father out of his land." "Aye," said Hamish, "and Alistair Pringle was blackmailing her to keep it quiet, threatening to destroy the evidence that could have proved his father was a thief." Blair looked confused, as if the world had suddenly become more complicated than he liked. "But that doesn't excuse murder." "No, sir," Hamish agreed. "It doesn't, but it does explain it." The arrest was anticlimactic. Blair, still trying to process the tangle of fraud and revenge and decades-old tragedy, led Mary to the police car with unusual gentleness. So she went quietly, with dignity, her head held high. Before she got in, she turned to Hamish. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding." Hamish nodded but said nothing. Some things didn't need words. After they'd driven away, Jimmy clapped Hamish on the shoulder. "You knew exactly where to put that evidence, didn't you? Made it so Blair couldn't possibly miss it." "Did I?" Hamish said innocently. "I'm just a lazy village constable who leaves things lying about." "Aye, and I'm the Queen of Sheba," Jimmy grinned. "Blair's going to take all the credit for solving this case, you know. That's the idea. And you'll avoid another promotion." "Exactly." Jimmy shook his head in admiration. "You're a devious man, Hamish Macbeth." "I prefer to think of myself as efficiently lazy," Hamish replied. "The trial, when it came 3 months later, was the talk of the Highlands. The fraud documents proved that Geoffrey Pringle had systematically stolen the Campbell land through falsified records and phantom debts. The revelation made national news, with journalists digging into the Pringle family's business dealings and finding a pattern of similar schemes across Scotland. Mary's defence team argued diminished responsibility, built a case around decades of trauma and the provocation of Alistair's blackmail threats. The prosecution, somewhat half-heartedly, pushed for a murder conviction. In the end, the jury returned a verdict of manslaughter, and the judge, taking into account Mary's previously unblemished record and the extraordinary circumstances, sentenced her to 8 years with possibility of parole after 5. The land, after lengthy legal proceedings, was returned to the Campbell estate. As Duncan Campbell's sole heir, Mary would inherit it upon her release from prison. Blair received a commendation for his brilliant detective work in solving a complex murder case and exposing a multi-generational fraud. He celebrated by going on a 3-day drinking binge that landed him in hospital with alcohol poisoning. Hamish received a strongly worded memo from Superintendent Daviot expressing disappointment in his failure to make significant progress on the case, and suggesting that perhaps Hamish was better suited to village policing than more challenging investigative work. Hamish filed the memo carefully in his bin and went home to his croft. The evening was mild, with a soft breeze coming in from the sea. Hamish sat on his doorstep with lugs at his feet and Sonsy draped across his shoulders like a ginger stole. In the distance, the peat bogs stretched dark and mysterious under the fading light. Archie McLean, freed from suspicion, was presumably at the pub avoiding his wife. Dr. Brodie was making his evening rounds, his secret salmon poaching safely buried along with the evidence. The Curry sisters were no doubt dissecting every detail of the trial for the benefit of anyone who would listen, and Hamish was exactly where he wanted to be, in Lochdew, with no prospect of promotion, no threat of transfer to Strathbane, and no ambition beyond keeping his village peaceful and his life simple. Justice, he said to Luggs, scratching the dog behind his enormous ears, is a complicated thing. Luggs wagged his tail in agreement. Inside the cottage, Hamish made himself a cup of tea and cut a slice of the shortbread that Angela Brodie had dropped off that morning. He settled into his armchair with a contented sigh. The case was closed. Mary Sutherland would serve her time and eventually reclaim her family's land. The truth about the Pringle family's crimes had been exposed, and Hamish Macbeth remained exactly what he'd always been, a lazy village constable who somehow managed to see justice done without ever appearing to do much of anything at all. Outside, the Highland night settled over Lochdew like a blessing. The mist rolled in from the sea, wrapping the village in its familiar embrace. Somewhere in the darkness, the peat bogs kept their remaining secrets close, and in his cottage by the water, Hamish Macbeth ate his shortbread, and fed scraps to his dog and his wild cat, and contemplated the perfect balance of his perfectly ordinary life. All was well in Lochdew, all was exactly as it should be.